Hi there. Welcome to A Push with Lennox. And today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at colonial society. Not necessarily the different regions of the colonies, although that's important, but more colonial society as a whole. Now, to understand, you do have to remember that there are distinct regions in the 13 colonies. But even though they have differences, there's a lot that's the same. But just as a recap, let's remember who came over and why. Each region had its own specific geography, climate, and natural resources. And those differences of the regions is going to attract different types of people. For example, in New England, the motivating factor for people to colonize there was religion. However, down in the southern regions, due to the fertile soil, the climate, agriculture was the number one economic industry. And so that's going to attract a lot of investors into that region. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. The big idea where everything is really the same is the economic system that's going to be created by England in the colonies. And it's a system of mercantilism. And if you remember correctly, mercantilism is the idea that colonies are going to boost up the economy of a mother country, which is the situation here with the English colonies. Now, England had certain goals when it came to their colonies, but the colonists had their own independent goals as well. As long as each one of them were meeting those goals, there wasn't going to be a lot of conflict or interaction. And so, what you're going to see happen in the first 150 years of the colonies is a system of salutary neglect is going to be in play. And what that meant was that though England governed the colonies, they also allowed the colonies to govern themselves, to kind of do their own things, because economically, England was experiencing success based on the colonies, and they didn't want to mess that up. Throughout the colonies, we had mixed economies. We had different economic foundations. Like I mentioned earlier, the South was all about agriculture, but when you moved up north into the New England area, a lot of forest and trees, so lumbering and shipbuilding was huge up there. Middle colonies, I always kind of see that as a mix of the colonial economics because they had both agriculture and trade and other things like that. All of the colonial regions also had the same type of labor systems in the beginning. They all started with indentured servants because people were coming to the colonies due to the lack of land and opportunity back in Europe. So indentured servitude was a way they could get here. But one thing you might not realize is all the colonies also had slavery at some point. Now, granted, most of the slaves were located in the southern region due to the agricultural foundation of their economics, and South Carolina, without a doubt, had the highest slave population. But at some point, as the number of indentured servants available dropped, new labor systems were introduced, and that included African slaves. Again, all 13 colonies were under the umbrella of the economic policy of mercantilism, this idea that they existed solely to enrich England. Now, yes, there were many reasons why people came to the colonies, but remember, they had to get permission from England to come here. They had to get charters, and England is not going to issue those charters if England's not going to make money. And then as the colonies started making more and more money for England, you started to see England kind of pull back as far as their regulating and governing the colonies because the system was working. Now, they did try to protect their investment. England is going to pass a series of navigation acts, and these acts were put in place to basically control trade coming out of the colonies because England, again, under mercantilism, they want all the benefits of their colonies. So they will pass certain laws like trade or goods can only be carried by English or colonial built ships. They had to go through, when these ships left the colonies, they had to go through English ports if they were headed anywhere else. And some goods, specifically goods like tobacco, that cash crop, could only be exported to England. See, the colonies originally were able to trade with other countries, France and Spain and Portugal, but England still regulated it. That's what that whole part number 2 says, that they had to go through English ports. England was going to get their money. So if I am I don't know, a furniture builder in New England, and I want to send my tables to France. I could do that initially, but my tables had to stop in England and we had to pay a tax to England, so they got their cut of the whole part. What you're going to see, though, is over time, smuggling is going to become a big problem because the English colonists are going to realize that the mother country, England, is making a lot more money than they are. Even though they're making some money, they want to make more. So they're going to, start implementing smuggling practices in order to kind of avoid the Navigation Acts. That idea of salutary neglect, though, England really didn't push the Navigation Acts until really the 1700s. So while there were laws in place, and yeah, they tried to enforce them here and there, it wasn't really, number one on their goals because they were still making lots of money. Now, I don't want to say that they never enforced the Navigation Acts. In fact, in 1686, they're going to create the Dominion of New England, which was this union of the New England and the Middle colonies. It was an administrative unit or union, and the whole purpose of it was for England to try to control the trade going in and out of that region. And so the Dominion of New England is going to be created. The charters for each of those colonies are going to be revoked, and Sir Edmund Andros is going to be put in charge. He's going to be appointed the governor of the Dominion of New England. And what he is going to do is he's going to try to basically strong arm the New England colonies into following the Navigation Acts. He is going to limit their town meetings, he's going to limit their self-government, and he's going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. Now, the citizens, the colonists, are not going to have much of this. They're going to push back. And at one point, they actually put Sir Andros on a ship and sent him back to England. Conflict could have boiled over at this point. However, in 1688, just 2 years later, the Glorious Revolution is going to take place. And we're going to start seeing the monarchy limited in its power. And that's when that happens, the colonists are going to rise up and rebel against the Dominion of New England. And that's going to basically lead to its demise. There's not going to be a willingness from the Parliament to fight with the colonists over this one administrative union, because quite honestly, New England, the middle colonies, they're still benefiting England. So why fight over something like this? Let's just keep the trade aflowing, okay? When we talk about politics, while each colonial region was run a little bit differently, they all had self-government. It existed throughout the colonies. And examples of this included the Mayflower Compact in 1620. You're going to see the town hall meetings start to spur up. You saw that with the Quakers in Pennsylvania. You saw it with the Puritans in New England. The Virginia House of Burgesses, a representative assembly, is going to be established in 1619 in the colony of Virginia. So though all of these colonies are still under the umbrella of the king and parliament in England, they're going to start self-governing. And one reason that all this self-government was established was due to the distance that existed between the colonies and Great Britain. On a good day, it would take several months for a ship to get from England to the colonies, and waiting for answers for what they could and couldn't do really wasn't feasible. So you're going to start seeing the colonial societies create their own government to make their own decisions. Kind of like when you first move out of your parents' house. You don't call your parents every single time saying, well, should I go to this store or that store? Should I get this cable company or that cable company? You start making decisions on your own. And that's what the colonies are starting to do, is they're starting to kind of venture out from mom's house and start making their own decisions. And that's where self-government came from. When we look at all of this, though, it wasn't always pretty. There were some conflicts. There was a little bit of a conflict with the Dominion of New England, and we saw that with Sir Edmund Andros. We also kind of see it on the political side. You're going to start seeing some of the colonists start to kind of feel their wild oats and start to challenge the English government. And while England allowed self-government, it wasn't a perfect setup because there were a lot of people in the colonies that were excluded from the government because typically you either had to own property or you had to be part of the church in order to partake in local politics. That was absolutely the scenario up in New England with the Puritans. But regardless of the political system that was in place, all of the colonies were ultimately under the rule of England. And sometimes they challenged that. The perfect example is what's called the Zenger case in 1733. In the Zenger case, John Peter Zenger is going to write an editorial for a local newspaper in New York, and he's going to criticize the royal governor. And in doing that, the English government's going to step up and say, you can't talk bad about the government. And they are going to charge him with libel. And libel means that you are printing false allegations or false statements about somebody. And the jury is going to find Zenger not guilty. And what they're going to say is he wrote that, and that's fine, but what he wrote was true, so he is not guilty of libel. This is going to establish this idea of a free press in the colonies, which will then extend to a free press in the United States today. I mean, it's the First Amendment. We have the freedom of the press. Another thing that happened during this time that affected all of the colonies is this movement known as the First Great Awakening. It was a religious revival that spread throughout all 13 colonies. Now, we know that some of the societies in the colonies were set up on the basis of religion. The New England, number one, the Puritans and the Separatists. There was some religious influence in the middle colonies as well. Think about William Penn and the Quakers. The southern colonies, they too. Maryland and the Catholic haven that was set up by Lord Baltimore. So religion does have undertones throughout all the colonies, but what's going to happen is it's going to explode in about the 1720s, 1730s. Religion, although it was established as a primary function of the colonies, especially in New England, it started to dwindle over time. An example of that is the Puritans up in Massachusetts. They're going to see the second and third generation of their colony start to drift away from the church. And that's going to scare them because remember, they were trying to run a religious commonwealth. And so they're going to institute what's known as the Halfway Covenant in 1662. And the Halfway Covenant basically said this: listen, we don't need you young people to convert entirely to the Puritan way of life. But if you just come halfway, meet us halfway, you can still be part of the church, and in doing that, you can still vote and take part in our political systems. And so basically, join our church, but don't have to be like us. And that was one way they tried to keep it going. It didn't really work. You're going to see a lot of religious conflicts throughout the late 1600s. The Salem witch trials is a perfect example. You're going to see people who were not adhering to the Puritan way of life being charged with witchcraft. And, there's going to be these trials where you have to prove that you're not a witch. And the only way you can prove it is to survive the attempt to kill you. And if you don't survive, I guess you weren't a witch. And if you do survive, well, you're a witch. We got to kill you. There's no way you can win. In the process, 10 people are going to be hung, and one person is going to be pressed to death. And pressed. Can you imagine that? The colonies overall in the late 1600s were changing. They were focusing more on economics than religion. But that doesn't mean that they were completely drifting away. There was still that core foundation, and that's what's going to grow out of, or what the First Great Awakening is going to grow out of. It happens between the 1730s, 1740s, and you're going to see a mass amount of conversions to Christianity during this time. Some of the key players, the people you should be familiar with, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards was one of these guys were like these, what I call fire and brimstone preachers. They would get up there and they just stir up your emotion and talk about, life, in Christianity versus life in hell and stuff like that. And Jonathan Edwards, one of his most famous sermons is "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, and what is that going to look like for your destiny and your eternity?" And George Whitefield is going to to travel up and down. He goes to all 13 colonies, spreading this message using what we call evangelical preaching and drawing people into the church and converting. And believe it or not, this is going to create divisions within the church. You're going to have the old guard, what we call the old lights, the traditional church attendees versus the new lights, those who wanted to see some change and maybe bring some more emotion and fire into the church. When we look at the old lights versus the new lights, this is just a quick chart to help you understand the differences. The old lights believed in a rational appeal of, Christianity. What makes sense? Whereas the new lights, no, it's emotion. It's what you feel in your heart that drives you closer to God. The old lights typically were educated. These were men who had gone to universities that had been established by the church, and they're going to bring their education back to the people. Where the new lights, like, no, once you're converted, you have the freedom and you have the ability to share your faith, to share the gospel with others. Old lights established classes. The hierarchy of society was present with the old lights, whereas the new lights, it was dispossessed. Everybody is welcome in the house of God, and there's no you and me and them, or you and they, and all that other stuff. Everyone is under the gospel, and everyone's under God's love. Some legacies that are going to come out of the First Great Awakening. Now, I didn't mention it earlier, but the Puritans had actually started some universities in order to keep their faith alive. Harvard is the first university that was created in the colonies, in America for that matter, and the whole purpose of Harvard was to train new Puritan ministers. Well, the First Great Awakening is also going to lead to more schools being established, like Dartmouth, Princeton, and Brown. And these schools also, while the New Lights didn't, basically buy into you had to be an educated to be a minister, they didn't see any harm in it either. So they're going to establish colleges as well. You're going to see this diversity of people within the religious halls and everything. It's not just, the Puritans or the wealthy or the educated. It's all people are going to be welcome in the church. And it's also going to drive up this idea of independence in our society. The idea behind it is, if you could choose your faith, what else can you choose? Could we maybe choose our government? So that idea, that independent thinking starts to be born during the First Great Awakening. You're also going to see the presence of the separation of church and state. If you remember, in the New England region, the church was the state and the state was the church. You're going to start seeing some ideas like we learned with Roger Williams when he was banished from New England, or for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that church and state needed to be separate. You don't want the government involved in your church. And that was the whole thing. We escaped England from that. Remember, in England, you had a state-run church. They didn't want that here in the colonies. So you see the division of church and state growing during this time. What's interesting about the First Great Awakening is even though it had such a profound effect here in the colonies, it was worldwide. Everywhere there was an English speaking, so all the English colonies throughout the world are going to be caught up in this First Great Awakening. And you're going to see a lot of different changing of thinking. Some of the stuff we've already talked about. But the colonies, the effect that it had on the colonies was huge. I guess you could call it the first movement that affected everyone in the English colonies. That's one thing that starts to kind of bring them together. Not 13 individual colonies, but slowly moving towards a group of unified colonies. So that's it. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about colonial society, and if not, as always, you have the ability to rewind and watch again. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.